Hello, I'm Michael Brown, President of the School for Advanced Research in Santa Fe, New Mexico. It's my great pleasure to host this event, which will feature Dr. Francis Levine, President and CEO of the Missouri Historical Society and the Missouri History Museum of St. Louis. Today's program is one of our more or less annual collaborations with the Historic Santa Fe Foundation. You'll be hearing from their executive director, my good friend Peter Warzel, shortly. Before I hand off to him, I'd like to thank the many SAR members who help make programs like this possible. I especially want to thank the Ethel Jane Westfeld Funding Foundation for their support of today's salon. This is just one of many online events focused on issues of broad concern that the School for Advanced Research is offering to stay connected to our members and the general public during the pandemic. Many of those who've registered are new to SAR, so I'd like to welcome you and encourage you to head to our website, sarweb.org, to explore all that we have to offer, including membership. Some housekeeping items. Depending on your device, you should have, or you probably have a panel, a control panel on the right. You will see that in the bottom third of that, there's something called a question box in that menu. So if you want to submit a question to the speaker, please do so. I will act as moderator and try my best to get to everyone's questions. The talk will last about 55 minutes. We try to end at 75 minutes, so probably have about 15 minutes of Q&A, and that probably means that some of you won't get your questions answered, but we'll do the best that we can. One final technical issue. In our experience, people often have better audio experiences if they're using headsets, especially if they're using a phone or a tablet device. Computers give you a little bit more control over the audio. Now we'll hear from Pete Warzel of the Historic Santa Fe Foundation, who will introduce Dr. Levine.
Hello to you all, and thank you for being here. I'm Pete Warzel, the Executive Director of the Historic Santa Fe Foundation. If you do not know us, we are a nonprofit founded in Santa Fe in 1961, focused on the preservation and education of cultural and architectural history in Santa Fe and the surrounding areas. In normal times, we would be holding monthly lectures, art, or history exhibitions in our offices at the iconic El Zaguan at 545 Canyon Road. We also would be holding events, educational outreach, and collaboration with other like-minded organizations with hands-on preservation projects with our staff and interns. A lot has changed during these difficult times the past 4 months. You can learn more about us and about becoming a member at historicsantafe.org, and I hope you take the time to visit there. For many years, SAR and HSFF held joint lectures, normally at the wonderful boardroom at SAR. This talk today is a restart of those former collaborations, also obviously changed to an online event given the circumstances. It is a pleasure to partner with the School for Advanced Research and a real treat to welcome Fran Levine to be our speaker today. Fran is well known and well respected in Santa Fe due to her long tenure at the New Mexico History Museum. The Santa Fe Trail that terminated here in downtown Plaza is approaching its 200th inaugural date in 2021. And what better way to look forward to that than to look back at the frontier women who helped open a new world. My friend Michael Brown will moderate the Q&A at the end of this talk, as I cannot be there in person. Thanks to all at SAR, at the Historic Santa Fe Foundation, to Michael, and especially to Fran Levine. I am certain you will enjoy this wonderful talk today.
Greetings from the other end of the Santa Fe Trail. I'm here in St. Louis, Missouri, which many of you may not even think of as the other end of the Santa Fe Trail. You may believe that it's Franklin or Arrow Rock or Independence, and all of those places have a role in the Santa Fe Trail. But I'm going to argue today that St. Louis is really the beginning of the Santa Fe Trail when you are going east to west, or the end of the Santa Fe Trail when you're coming from Santa Fe back to St. Louis. I'm going to be talking today about two different women who were part of Santa Fe Trail history. And we also need to remember that the Santa Fe Trail met in Santa Fe and formed a junction with the Camino Real de Tierra Adentro. And it was the Camino Real de Tierra Adentro that turned the Santa Fe Trail from a continental trail into really a trail of global commerce. That may be a slight exaggeration, but not much. And the two women who I'm going to talk about really are a part of a very fascinating time. I'm going to talk about María Rosa Villalpando Salé de Lajoie, who was born in Taos, and I'm also going to talk about Carmel Benavides Robidoux, who was also from Santa Fe, but made her way across the Santa Fe Trail. And I have to say that part of my fascination with the Santa Fe Trail, of course, is having lived at both ends of the trail. And when I was in Santa Fe, I thought pretty much just about that part of the trail and that part of the trail history that impacted Santa Fe. I thought about the trade goods that were brought down the Santa Fe Trail. Because my office was in the Palace of the Governors, I could almost imagine what it was like when those wagons pulled up onto the plaza and unloaded hardware and calico cloth and coffee and shoes and boots and other manufactured items that came from St. Louis. But I started wondering what went back across the Santa Fe Trail from Santa Fe to Missouri. And of course, what went back across the Santa Fe Trail had a much wider catchment area. It included items that came from Mexico. It included items that came from other places as well. So when I talk about these women on the trail, finding the women on the trail was also a part of what I found to be so fascinating. In fact, finding women's stories on the Santa Fe Trail is nearly an archaeological enterprise. And it's very hard to find women except in the footnotes, but you will see that María Rosa Villalpando Salé de Lajoie was very different, and she is found quite remarkably throughout the history of the trail. When I talk about María de la Cruz Carmen Benavides, I'll sometimes call her Carmel because that's the name she was known by in Santa Fe. And you're going to see that by embracing these women's perspectives, by talking about the women's roles on the trail, that it really changes our understanding of who came across the Santa Fe Trail, of how Santa Fe was linked to the rest of the continent. And also, we're going to see a little bit more about the role of the French in the Santa Fe Trail than we may have thought about before. So in our slideshow, we are now looking at two contrasting images. We're looking at the wharfs of St. Louis. That's a Thomas Easterly daguerreotype that was taken in 1853. And on the other side of the slide, we're looking at one of the earliest photographs of the Palace of the Governors that was taken in 1867. And those slides actually pair very, very well in making the point that it was the wharves and the riverboats along the Mississippi River in St. Louis that are the eastern end of the trail. Because without that robust economy and the markets served from Santa Fe, we would really have had very limited distribution of materials along the trail. So I sometimes say, no, it didn't take between 1853 and 1867 for the goods to get across the trail. But we really didn't have great photographs of the palace until that first shot in 1867. So I say the trail began on the banks of the Mississippi River, crossed the Missouri River, and from there headed across the continent, a continent of nations, of native people, of fur trappers and traders, Spanish, French, traders of Mexican and German heritage. And we're also going to see that key to the success and the expanding trade networks was the idea that the Santa Fe Trail brought important goods to both ends of the trail. When we look at the birth of the Santa Fe Trail, we often hear the story of William Becknell, that William Becknell was the right person in the right place. And in the September of 1821, he headed across from Arrow Rock, Missouri, to the Rocky Mountains to trade with native peoples for furs and hides. But there's actually quite a bit earlier history of the Santa Fe Trail and those connections between Missouri and both Taos and Santa Fe. And we know that some of the trade took place really starting in the late 18th century. And it starts with native peoples trading. And then the French settle St. Louis between 1763 and 1764, and they begin to look west quite early to the hides, to the native groups to trade with. And we will look at how that ties into the story of María Rosa. The French Creole traders really began to enter the trade quite earnestly, first in the 1760s, and then by about 1817, there are French Creole traders from St. Louis who are trying earnestly to set up a trading base in Santa Fe. They don't succeed, and in part because of the restrictionist trade policies that Mexico has, and that Spain has on trade in the colonies. So Spain did not allow the colonies to trade. Two things converge, or several things converge. In 1819, there's a total bank collapse in the American part of North America. And in 1821, the Mexican independence from Spain means that the Mexican colonies, like New Mexico, are beginning to look for where they are going to, how they're going to improve their economy. Missouri also becomes quite interested in the fur trade and begins to look west. Mexican authorities in New Mexico begin to look east. And so, yes, it's for sure that that William Becknell was the right person in the right place, but it comes after many years of attempts to establish trade between Missouri and Santa Fe. Now, the story of María Rosa Villalpando really comes out of a footnote that I read in Josiah Gregg's book, Commerce of the Prairies. And Josiah Gregg's book, it's really a very important reference work on the trail and was published in 1844. Josiah Gregg was a bookkeeper, a trader, a pharmacist who traveled the trail between 1831 and 1840. And, you know, he really gives you a very detailed look at what's happening on the Santa Fe Trail. He dismisses St. Louis. He says, St. Louis is not important in the Santa Fe Trail. It's really not until you get to other points west of St. Louis that the trail begins. But yet, all through his journals, he talks about the trade that went back and forth. And in a footnote on page 105, he talks about the story of María Rosa Villalpando. And that's where I found this fascinating story. One of the things, though, that I also found here in St. Louis that was amazing to me were Josiah Gregg's botanical specimens. So as Josiah Gregg was traveling the Santa Fe Trail, one of the things that he did was to send back to St. Louis botanical specimens to what would become the collection of the Missouri Botanical Garden. And so it was quite remarkable to me to find Gregg. To find his very specimens. These are two items that he collected on the Santa Fe Trail right near Mora. And in 1847, he sent them back to St. Louis. So he's corresponding with people in St. Louis, but he's not thinking about it as the place where trade goods arrive. So Maria Rosa Villalpando, this is an amazing story. And Maria Rosa was born in Ranchos de Taos. And on August 4th, 1760, she was kidnapped from her family's compound in a raid on the Taos area by Comanches. And she was separated from her son, Jose Julian Jaques, who was an infant at the time. Her mother was murdered in this raid. Her father had been away on a trading expedition, and he was not there. This is a very brutal period of New Mexico history. Well, Gregg relates that the story of Maria Rosa Villalpando, he blends a kind of folklore and a kind of consistent romantic trope through the story of Maria Rosa. So Josiah Gregg blames Maria Rosa for her own captivity. He claims that she was, as an infant, promised as the bride of a Comanche chief, and that when she refused to marry him, the Comanche chief was so enraged that he attacked the community of Ranchos de Taos. But it's a little more complicated than that, of course. The Comanches had really had a very long relationship of raid and trade throughout the 18th and into the 19th century between Taos and the Comanches. It's very likely that Maria Rosa's family was very involved in the trade with the Comanches. But for Josiah Gregg, this is a romantic story. And he recorded this story in St. Louis in about 1839. And Maria Rosa lived in St. Louis until 1830. And Josiah Gregg says, there are many people yet living who remember with what affecting pathos the old woman was wont to tell her tale of woe. It's more than a tale of woe. It's a fascinating period of history. So let me start a little bit about that. So as I said, bands of Comanches attacked Ranchos de Taos on August 4th, 1760. And it was very likely in response to failed trade negotiations between the government of New Mexico and the Comanches. There's also some indication that the Comanches attacked Ranchos in retaliation for a scalp dance that had been performed at Taos Pueblo earlier. But bands of Comanches swooped down, and although Maria Rosa is not named in the official report, we know that many women and children were taken. And we know that this trade in women and children was really a part of the Taos trade. Maria Rosa was a married woman at the time. She was a mother of at least one son. And she likely joined the Comanches. The Comanches would have taken her from Ranchos to their summer camp along the Arkansas River, east of Taos. And it was probably there that she met Jean-Baptiste Salé dit Lajoie. And Jean-Baptiste was one of the early settlers of St. Louis. And it was the French who had been trading with Comanches, Pawnees, with the traders with the native peoples on the east side of New Mexico. She became pregnant soon after she was taken captive, and she was also traded from the Comanches to the Pawnees. So we're not actually sure if Salé Jean-Baptiste met her in the Comanche camp or in the Pawnee camp. But by 1767 or so, Jean-Baptiste is living in a Pawnee camp with María Rosa. Lajoie himself had been born in Santé, France around 1741. He was recruited to be one of the early settlers of St. Louis, and he would have been around 23 when he arrived in St. Louis, and around 26 when he met María Rosa. Her age at the time that she was kidnapped is not quite pinned down. There are some researchers who believe she was in her 30s. I'm going to argue that she was probably also in her 20s because she had several more children with Jean-Baptiste. Jean-Baptiste had been a voyageur with the founding party, meaning he was one of the founders of St. Louis, and he became a baker in St. Louis, which was an extremely important profession. St. Louis was not much of an agricultural settlement. In one of the next slides, we're going to see the Dufossé map of St. Louis, which comes from the Biblioteca Nacional de España, and it shows the village of San Luis, then referred to as Pain Court, meaning short of bread. So Jean-Baptiste's property in 1767 show the fields, that he's growing grain, and that he was known in the documents as a good baker, and he was also a trader as well. María Rosa and Jean-Baptiste are living in one of the Pawnee settlements in around 1767, but he will bring her back to St. Louis, and there she will join a French Creole community. Their son, Lambert, so by now this is her third child. Remember, she has Julian, who is left behind as an infant in Taos. She has Antoine, who she has with either a Comanche or a Pawnee, and she has Lambert, who is the son she has, the first child that she has with Jean-Baptiste. And he brings her back to St. Louis in a very pivotal time. And it's a really emerging Creole settlement. They come back and they settle into what will be, the town site begins to be laid out, and they settle in what will be Block 57 of the town site. Those of you who have been to St. Louis, it's right under the arch where they would have settled in that part of St. Louis. Well, on July 3rd, 1770, they enter into a marriage contract. And that's a very important document. There are about 500 settlers in St. Louis in 1770 when they write their marriage contract. Remember that it is French Catholic, so at the time, St. Louis is governed by the Spanish, although the population of St. Louis is predominantly French. It's really quite, in some ways, quite a worldly settlement, only in that it is still connected to its French roots in Illinois and also down the river into New Orleans. So there are about in 1770, there are about 500 settlers, and María Rosa would have found a population of people of mixed ancestry. She would have found people of French and of Spanish ancestry. She would also have found Métis, people of Métis or Native American and French ancestry. And she would have also found an African American community as well. She may have met other women in that settlement as well who had had children of different fathers and mixed blood ancestry. It's interesting that Maria Rosa and Jean-Baptiste enter into their marriage contract on July 3rd, because by July 10th of 1770, the governor of Upper Louisiana, which encompasses the area of St. Louis, decrees that you must make a commitment to either raising your enslaved household owners, your household servants, or you have to identify what you're going to do with the enslaved Indian people who you have in your household. Doesn't say much about the African Americans, but with Native peoples, he wants to know what is your intent, and they are no longer able to sell enslaved people after that time. So the timing of the marriage contract is quite interesting. The Spanish Lieutenant Governor Pedro Piernas was charged with enumerating the Native American men, women, and children who were enslaved in both St. Genevieve and St. Louis. And so the enumeration was completed on July 8th, and Lajoie is shown as the owner of Indian slaves, a boy and a girl, each about 13 years old, who are not baptized. Their tribal affiliation is not shown, nor is Antoine, whose ancestry was at least half Native American. So Antoine always occupies this kind of middle space. When Jean-Baptiste and Maria Rosa marry, they claim as their natural child Lambert, and they say that Antoine, born in captivity, they will raise, they will educate, but he is not entitled to any part of their estate. On the 1791 census of their St. Louis household, they have 3 enslaved people, 2 men of mixed race and 1 woman who is said to be Negro. I find that quite interesting that Maria Rosa herself begins to trade in enslaved peoples when she herself had been enslaved. Maria Rosa and Jean-Baptiste have 4 more children. They have Pierre, born in 1771, twins Marie Hélène and Marie Joseph, born in 1773, and then another child, Antoine, here we would say Antoine Xavier, I would say Antoine Javier, but Antoine Xavier, born in 1776. So they have quite a family, and they are living a quite prosperous life until January of about 1792. And in January of 1792, their daughter, Marie Hélène, marries Benjamin Leroux d'Ensemble, and Maria Rosa is abandoned by Lajoie, and Jean-Baptiste takes Lambert and returns to France in the company of a neighbor woman. And Maria Rosa is not a woman to be trifled with. And beginning at about this period of time in the late 1790s, Maria Rosa begins a series of lawsuits. And she does that both to exert her right to certain property, but she's also distributing her property to her children. In 1802, it's a busy year. She's putting her estate together. She is willing pieces of property to her children, to her grandchildren. It includes distributing her enslaved children. And she then has probably one of the greatest surprises of her life when in 1802, her son, Jose Julian Jaques from New Mexico, appears in St. Louis, and he comes to claim his share of her maternal estate. Now you might ask, how did he find her? How did he know she was there? And remember that there is a tremendous amount of communications through French fur traders, through some diplomatic attempts to establish a road between St. Louis and Santa Fe. So between 1792 and 1802, there are traders going back and forth, and it's likely that Jose Julian hears about Maria Rosa and that she's living in St. Louis. He comes to St. Louis in 1802, and he sues his mother to have a share of her maternal estate. And at this time, Lambert, remember, is back in France with his father. And it appears that several of her other children have died, because the only person who makes a settlement with him is Maria Len, and she settles with him for $200 in hard cash. So it's a pretty fascinating story, but Jose Julian claims that he needs this cash for his growing family in St. Louis, only he doesn't go back to St. Louis. He goes to San Antonio, where he is involved with another woman. And it actually takes the governor of New Mexico to write the governor of San Antonio to get him to come back and support his family. So it's really quite remarkable story. The other thing is that Maria Rosa, although she doesn't read and write, she is probably more well known in the documents than many women of the 19th century because of the lawsuits that she files. And she also makes a claim against Jean-Baptiste, and she writes to Jean-Baptiste and asks for more money from him, more settlement. And she writes to him in Bordeaux, and he writes back in 1817, claiming that he had left her with sufficient resources, that he had left her with a store of supplies and wine and pelts, that he had left her a house, that he had left her everything he had, and that when he went back to France, he did not have the resources that he thought he would have. And so Maria Rosa continues to operate as a trader. She continues to make her own living. On the 1805 census, she is shown as a property owner. She's actually pretty well fixed. I kept looking for a photo, for a drawing, a print, something of Maria Rosa. And on one of the next slides, you're going to see images of Creole life in St. Louis. And in the summer of 1818, Anna Maria von Poole, who is a watercolorist, came to St. Louis, and she produced a series of paintings of life in St. Louis. They're charming pictures of French Creole life, showing the houses, the clothing, and she did one portrait that I would love to be able to tell you is Maria Rosa, but I can't. And it's the woman that you see on the screen, wrapped in the trade blanket, wearing moccasins, with the red stripe down the center of her hair. And I'd love to tell you that that was Maria Rosa, but I have been cautioned that I can't really say that because we don't know that that was Maria Rosa. But we know that Maria Rosa, as a woman of property, that she had tremendous rights as a woman of French colonial Upper Louisiana. She had the right to buy and sell property. She had the right to inherit and hold title to property on her own. She really learned to manage her affairs, protecting her property through the courts under Spanish law, under American jurisprudence. And we really have a tremendous amount of material about Maria Rosa. The portrait that you see on the left side of the screen is Maria Helene, and that is Maria Rosa's only surviving daughter. That is an 1859 daguerreotype that was then turned into a portrait drawing of her in 1863. And so that's the closest I've come to figuring out what Maria Rosa may have looked like. She dies an old woman. She's said to be over 100 years old. She dies on July 28th, 1830. Oh my goodness. And it is July 28th today, as we do this lecture. So she dies 60 years after she came to St. Louis. And I went to the newspapers thinking there had to be just an amazing piece about her in the news. But of course, there was nothing. There's just something that says she died at the home of her daughter on Elm Street, and that she claimed to be over 100 years old. But I think that what Maria Rosa's story is really a rather remarkable story. And I mean, it's incredible to me that we are able to trace her back from 1760 to 1830 in her own words. That's remarkable. She arrived in St. Louis when it was a settlement that was still ringed by mounds and archaeological remains of the Mississippians. She witnessed the changing of governments from France to Spain, back to France, and then the American sovereignty. She saw the arrival of the first steamship in 1817 that would create that port city that would feed the Santa Fe Trail. And she very likely met New Mexicans throughout the time that she lived in St. Louis. Perhaps she even spoke with Pedro Vial and Juan Lucero from Villanueva, New Mexico, who spent the winter of 1792-1793. They spent 8 months in St. Louis recovering from a Pawnee attack on their diplomatic party. But her legacy as a captive is what is so incredible to me, because her story is still told, maybe not here in St. Louis until I started talking about her, but her story is performed as part of the dance cycle every year at Ranchos de Taos. And on New Year's Day, each year, the villages in the Ranchos area look again at their Comanche heritage. They look at the story of the Cautivos. They look at the stories of those who were taken and who were never returned to New Mexico. The portrait on your right, both of these photographs were taken by Miguel Gandert, and Miguel Gandert has photographed the Los Comanches de Taos, who are a dance troupe who perform every year. And Miguel and Enrique La Madrid have recorded the stories of the Cautivos. I sent them a copy of the paper that I wrote on Maria Rosa, and they were just, members of the community have called me. I've now been visited by some of Maria Rosa's descendants who are so amazed that anyone was able to find these details of her story. But, it would have taken me, I don't know that I ever would have figured out this story if I'd lived in Santa Fe. It took me that time to get to St. Louis and to dig into these, to dig into the sources. I never knew that it would take a move to St. Louis to help me figure out the real meaning of the Santa Fe Trail. And so I'm going to talk now about the second woman from Santa Fe who's also taught me so much about the Santa Fe Trail. And that's, well, first let me talk about what the mutual benefits were. So in many culture context situations, women play an important role in linking people of different cultures. And that was true along the Santa Fe Trail as well. Women acted as cultural brokers, negotiating cross-cultural customs. Women were also sometimes the first to be noticed as people along the trail. And even if their story, or to notice and to write about the people along the trail. So they were sometimes consorts, sometimes wives to mountain men and traders, but women also provided an enormous amount of labor to the Indian trade and to the fur trade. So the trade with Native Americans, I should say, and the fur trade. Native women are the ones who processed hides. African American women and Anglo-American women were often some of the domestic laborers and cooks along the trail. But we know very little about their own words. That's why Maria Rosa is so unusual. But now we're going to talk about Maria de la Cruz, or Carmel Benavides Robidoux. And she illustrates some of the economic and social benefits that derived to men and women on the Santa Fe Trail. And Maria Carmel, let me just call her Carmel so I don't accidentally call her Maria Rosa. Carmel was born in New Mexico and baptized as a two-day-old in the church in Santa Fe. And here we have an illustration of her baptismal record. Carmel was born into a New Mexican family, the Baca family, with very, very deep roots, and the Benavides family. Her family lived on the east side of the Santa Fe Plaza in a property that was known as the Calle de Granero. And her property is part of the property that became part of 109 East Palace, where of course the Manhattan Project office was located. We don't have a word of Maria Rosa in her own writing. We don't have an image of her. We don't have a signature of her, but yet her story is one about the way in which French, Creole, and New Mexican cultures came together on the Santa Fe Trail. We have only some imaginings of what she might have looked like. And one that I think is rather remarkable is one that was recorded and quoted by Mary Jean Cook in 1998, that was recorded about her, and quote, "It was said about Carmel that there is not a youth within a radius of 50 miles of Santa Fe, but would have braved the very jaws of death for a smile from the fair Carmel, or a glance of the dark eyes that shone with the splendor of the stars that twinkle in the southern firmament." Pretty florid description. But Carmel was born at a time when New Mexico was nearing the end of Spanish rule. She was born at the time, during the time of the Mexican Revolution. The year she was born, Spain was reaching out to the colonies, trying to figure out what they could do. And Maria Rosa's maternal uncle, Pedro Bautista Pino, was a delegate to the Cadiz of Spain in 1812. And he presented a very detailed report on conditions in New Mexico. In his report on the economy, he noted that there was a lack of sufficient markets and trades. He noted the absence of schools, the need for more support from the church. He outlined the insufficiency of the military with chronic shortages of arms and soldiers and the depredations of nomadic tribes. His list of needs was compelling, but he came back to New Mexico with very little to show for it. And he speculated that Americans could easily conquer this weak outpost if Spain didn't do more. Little did he know that within a decade, the Americans would indeed take over New Mexico, and they would also win his niece. When she was 17 or so, Carmel took up with Antoine Robidoux, a Santa Fe Trail trader, mountain man, and fur trader from Florissant, Missouri. Florissant was really the heart of the French colonial and the Métis community in Missouri. So Antoine Robidoux was the third of 6 sons and 2 daughters born to Joseph Robidoux and his wife, Catherine Rollet. He was born on September of 1794, and he was raised in the French Catholic in the French Catholic traditions of the Florissant area. But he very likely also spoke Spanish as well. His father, Joseph Robidoux, along with his 6 brothers, also Joseph, Francois, Isidore, Antoine, Louis, and Michel, were very prominent in the fur trade. Their names are intertwined with other Frenchmen who traded with native peoples across a wide area from the Intermountain West, from St. Louis, north to the Missouri River, to the Black Hills of the Dakotas, and then west to the Rocky Mountains and into the Great Basin. Antoine received a permit to come to New Mexico from the Mexican authorities in February of 1824. And for the next 2 years, he and his brothers, Michel and Isidore, and occasionally brother Louis, would trade between New Mexico and the Great Basin for hides. By 1826, they had established a kind of trading post in Taos, and brother Louis Robidoux had already taken up with a common law wife, Guadalupe Garcia. And that was a very important part of the way in which French colonial influence grew, was through social connections and business connections. And so the Robidoux brothers, when they came to New Mexico, they associated with elite families of New Mexico. And they began through common law marriages and through marriages, through formal marriages, to cement their relationships in the community. Carmel and Antoine were certainly an item, you might say, by the summer of 1829. And on July 16th, 1829, Antoine and Louis appeared before the Mexican government to be naturalized as Mexican citizens. And they claimed that they were residents and that they were married in Santa Fe. I could find no marriage license for Antoine, but he and Carmel were together the rest of their lives. There were many advantages to them to marry into the power structure of New Mexico. That's part of the mutual benefits that they derived. There would be lower taxes on the goods that they would import from the United States. It would mean that they could trap furs on certain rivers that were only open to New Mexican residents. And it would give them less chance of having their furs confiscated in the shifting political winds of New Mexico. So through his association with Carmel, Antoine had ties to elite families in Santa Fe, and Carmel would have the ties to the elites of the Florissant St. Louis area. She seems to have traveled back and forth across the trail several times, and I tried really hard to reconstruct where she was at any period of time. And so I have a slide here called On the Trail of Carmel. I found a shopping list for her in Santa Fe in 1832. And then I find her in Missouri in 1850. And it seems like in 1844, in the summer of 1844, she would have come back to Missouri with Antoine. Antoine had a thriving business, and he even served for a while on the ayuntamiento of Santa Fe. So both Louis and Antoine served in political positions in the government of New Mexico. So they ascended very, very rapidly, and that was part of their association with both the Garcia family and the Baca family that gave them that kind of access. So they had very deep roots that would support their trade networks, their commercial interests, as well as their social function. Being raised in a French Catholic Creole culture, I think that he may have shared many similarities with the upraising that Carmel would have had. But what did Carmel get out of this association? You know, it opened the possibility for her of a much wider world. And St. Louis was really a much more cosmopolitan place in the 1840s than was Santa Fe. So she would have joined a very robust family. They had a lot of notoriety as well, because her family was just, the Robidoux family is such a mixture of Métis and French and Native American. They were racially and culturally quite mixed. In secondary sources, it's claimed that she probably did 6 crossings of the Santa Fe Trail between 1830 and 1888 when she died. Antoine is much easier to trace. And he and his brother, but we still don't know whether Carmel is with him at any particular time. So there are times that he is in Santa Fe in one season, he's in Taos in another season, he's back in St. Louis in another season, and he's in the Great Basin at other times. But it was nearly impossible to link them up. Antoine's fortunes changed very rapidly between 1841 and 1843, and that was due to livestock losses and the collapse of the fur trade in the Great Basin. He left New Mexico very quickly in 1844, following a raid on the Palace of the Governors by the Utes. This is a very well documented incident, and he may have been blamed in part, along with other French traders, for supplying guns to the Utes. So Antoine comes back to Missouri with Carmel. And Carmel, then I'm able to trace Carmel around the area of St. Joseph, Missouri, which had been established by Joseph Robidoux, brother of Antoine Robidoux. And he stays there till about the summer of 1846. And in the summer of 1846, Antoine does something quite fascinating. He offers himself as an interpreter to Stephen Watts Kearney and the Army of the West. And here the story becomes quite dramatic. It's almost impossible to contain the story within the lecture. But Antoine writes to Kearney, offering his services as the interpreter. I wonder so much what Carmel thought of this, that in a sense, he was offering himself as an interpreter to the army that would take over and take New Mexico for the US. But of course, we have nothing that says that. The Battle of San Pasqual in December of 1846, there is the Battle of San Pasqual, and it's like a scene out of a movie, because at that battle, Stephen Watts Kearney is there, Kit Carson is there, Antoine Robidoux is there, and Lieutenant W.H. Emery are all participants in the battle. Kearney and Robidoux are both very seriously wounded, and Carson breaks the stock of breaks one of his rifles. That rifle happens to be in the collection of the Missouri Historical Society. And when I stood there holding that rifle, I was rather remarkably amazed of how all this stuff comes together. So Antoine is seriously wounded in this battle at San Pasqual, and Emery tells the story of Antoine. They're really afraid that he is going to bleed out, and people stay up with him all night long, trying to tend to him. It's bitterly cold. And when he wakes up in the morning, he comes to after they think he is nearly dead, and he says, "I smell coffee. So, is there somebody cooking coffee? I think coffee would revive me." And Emery says in his report, "We thought that he was hallucinating, that he was thinking about the cafes of St. Louis and New Orleans. But in fact, someone is making coffee, and Antoine drinks this cup of coffee and remarkably is revived and lives to tell the story of this battle." And it's really an incredible story. It takes Antoine a couple of years to get back to St. Joseph, Missouri, and in that time, I can trace Carmel living with different families near St. Joseph, Missouri, on the 1850 census, on the 1860 census, and even on the 1860 census, when Antoine is certainly back with her. He's not named. But she is certainly there. She's living with parts of the Robidoux family. Sometimes she seems to have a granddaughter with her who came into her life through the Robidoux family. She does not have any children of her own that we know. Antoine dies on August 20th, 1860 in St. Joseph. And in his will, which you see as one of the documents on the screen, he talks about his darling Carmelita, and he makes Carmel the heir to all of his property. And she stays in St. Louis only a short time, and then she and her 10-year-old granddaughter, Amanda Barada, travel across the Santa Fe Trail again back to St. Louis, back to Santa Fe. And when she comes back to Santa Fe, she settles in her old family property, the Baca family property on Calle Granero. And so that becomes, she then sells that property to Governor Prince, and Governor Prince begins the restoration of that property. But Carmel does not stay in Santa Fe. In 1867, her granddaughter, Amanda, marries Frederick Stolzheimer, whose journals we have at the Palace of the Governors, and they move to Conejos, Colorado, where he is the Indian agent to the Utes, and Carmel goes with them. And she's remembered at that time in the stories of pioneers of Colorado as riding her horse from Conejos to Durango. She dies in January of 1888, and she is buried in the Greenmount Cemetery in Durango. So she's far, far from Antoine, but you know, they lived their lives separately for a while. She's in Colorado, and he is in St. Joseph, Missouri. Their stories are amazing, but they're not the only stories. And I am out of time, so I will only tell you very briefly that in El Palacio and in the Gateway magazine of the Museum of the Missouri Historical Society, I have been writing stories of different women who are spending their time on the trail. Kate Kingsbury is another woman whose history is documented both in Santa Fe and collections of the Missouri Historical Society. I have recorded, and Alicia Abbott has also recorded Kate Kingsbury's grave in the Oddfellows Cemetery on Cerrillos Road in Santa Fe. And in our collections here in St. Louis, I found the John Kingsbury's letter ordering her gravestone that was then taken across the Santa Fe Trail and put on her grave in Santa Fe. Another woman who I found just fascinating, and I will be writing more about her, is Francisca Lopez de Kimball. And Francisca Lopez de Kimball was born in New Mexico and came across the Santa Fe Trail as a 7-year-old after the death of her mother. She was raised in the Visitation Academy here. Her father put her in the hands of the Sisters of the Visitation in the summer of 1852, and then he died shortly afterwards, and she then becomes a ward of Manuel Alvarez, who is the Spanish ambassador, and he dies the following year. And so she spends a good part of her life living at Visitation Academy. She marries very well in Santa Fe, and her father and Manuel Alvarez had told her, don't go back to Santa Fe. Don't ever go back to New Mexico. Stay in St. Louis and you will have a better life. And I've just written about other men and women who were brought over the Santa Fe Trail as young children to study in schools here. So there's a fascinating, fascinating history of connection of both ends of the trail. You know, I've had to leave out some of the more obvious women to talk about. I've had to really jam in a lot today, but I think what's important about these women's stories is the legacy of that history. The fact that the Santa Fe Trail really served to bring together families from both ends of the trail. the Santa Fe Trail, I think that we have really got to expand our understanding of the importance of the trail. It's not just a trail of commerce. It's not just a trail of military history. It's really about, it's about the way in which families and communities grew across from both ends and met to create this country. And I think that, you know, we have this myth of the national melting pot where all cultures are neutralized and become American. But I believe that the Santa Fe Trail, when we unpack the stories of those who lived along the Santa Fe Trail, we're able to get a much more nuanced history, to see the way in which French and Spanish, later German and Jewish merchants wove together the fabric of the United States. It's been just fascinating for me to be able to work on this project, to look at the way our national identity was formed, and to remember that that we are able to tell these stories when we look at the stories of families, when we look at the stories of women, and when we look at the way in which the country was created from these family histories and commercial histories. So thank you so much. I really enjoyed being with you. I stand for questions.
Fran, thank you so much for a fascinating talk. I have a question, and some others are coming in. Backing up your story a little bit to the period of slavery, what did slavery mean in the early period? Was it true chattel slavery? I mean, I was just thinking about how permeable the borders were that enslaved you know, Hispanic people, and Hispanic people had Native American slaves and Anglos. So there was traffic back and forth, and sometimes people came out of slavery, like the people you mentioned. Other times they stayed in slavery. So what did it actually mean in a practical sense?
You know, I think it depends on where you are on the trail at what period of time. Of course, it is chattel slavery in Missouri at a time. Now, remember, Native Americans are released from chattel slavery by 1770 in Missouri, but African American people stay chattel slavery. In New Mexico, we have peonage, and that's slightly different than chattel slavery, but it is still the enslavement of people's labor. So, and then blacks are so thoroughly excluded from New Mexico in the 18th and 19th century by law, by writ. And so it's, you know, I think that's one of the things about the early history. And when I mean early, I mean the mid 18th up to the beginning of the 19th century. We really see trafficking in women and children as a part of what's happening, what's going back and forth in interregional trade. It's not just east to west, it's also up and down the Missouri River, the Mississippi River. I have to say that's the hardest part of writing for me. And I am now working on a chapter on women on the African American women on the Santa Fe Trail. And you know, the first time I read one of the documents where María Rosa is deeding to her granddaughter's babies, who she says her enslaved African American women had promised to her, it's a little disturbing. But that traffic in people, Ned Bladhawk has written about them, James Brooks. There's been a lot of writing about the enslavement of people on the trail.
But it was also the case that the enslaved people, especially if they emerged from that, had the kind of bicultural or tricultural knowledge that ended up being very important in trading relations. Isn't that right?
Yes, and I think that's one of the things about María Rosa that, you know, there are a couple times I noticed that I said María Rosa when I meant Carmel, and I said Santa Fe when I meant St. Louis. So I'm sorry about that if you all caught me on that. I think that's one of the important things about Maria Rosa, is that she must have been a very valuable and very knowledgeable, both to the native peoples in the Comanche camps, in the Pawnee camps, as well as when she came over here to St. Louis. I mean, she knew that country. She knew the languages. She knew she knew people at both ends and also in the communities. So I think she's a very sharp trader. She's a very sharp woman, and I think it comes from that exposure that she had through being trafficked in a way.
The question has come in from Sandra. The question is, what defines Creole in Maria Rosa's life when she was living in St. Louis? What did it mean to be a Creole in that context?
So in that context, Creole, I use the word French when I talk about the people in St. Louis. In her case, Lajoie was from France. He was not French Canadian. And when we say French, it covers a lot of experiences. Those who were born in France and came through Canada, through New Orleans, they could have been French Canadians who had come down the Mississippi and the Missouri River. So when we say Creole, it's that mixture of French and Spanish and native. And there's a great deal of intermarriage between the French traders, the Osage, the Delawares, there's, when I think of St. Louis, we often talk about it being the confluence and being the confluence of the Mississippi and the Missouri. But it's a lot more than that. It's a confluence of people of many, many cultures. And so when we talk about Creole, it's that mixture of many cultures.
I see. There's another comment here that I think you'll appreciate. It says, I'm honored to be part of this webinar and hear about my 5 times great-grandmother. My name is Diana Landry, and please thank Dr. Fran for bringing more information about my grandmother to the world.
So Diana contacted me. The very first, I did an article in our Gateway magazine, and Diana contacted me and said she was Maria Rosa's great, if I just did 5 granddaughters. And when she walked into the museum to meet me, she looked and felt like a New Mexican sister to me. And she lives in Illinois, and we do keep in touch. And she and her cousin Adele are really working hard to try to get the National Park Service to tell the fuller story of Maria Rosa in their interpretation at the Arch. Maria Rosa's history is enormous, and I'm so grateful to Diana and Deli for keeping in touch with me and for appreciating this story of their great-great-great-great-great-grandmother.
It's quite a story. Here's another question from William McDonald. Do we know if Maria Rosa and Carmel met or interacted in any way?
You know, I don't think so, because I think Carmel probably, she didn't seem to get back to Missouri until around the early 1840s. Now, if she was in Florissant, they were married in 29, and I think that that Antoine Robidoux and Carmel stayed in Santa Fe, and Carmel stayed with her family in Santa Fe till around 1840, and Maria Rosa, of course, died in 1830. So I don't think they met, but it's interesting to know what they may have known about each other.
Of course. Here's an interesting comment, and there are other questions coming in too. Would it be a stretch to say that those persons who move from east to west or west to east, frequently intermarrying, living at different ends of the trail, became the interpreters of the larger experience to their country people who are less exposed? Or would that be a 21st century preoccupation, the international citizen? That's from Timothy Carson.
Tim, also a good friend from Missouri and writer about this area. You know, I think that they were very much the interpreters for their neighbors. And I think that was something else that Maria Rosa would have been able to do, is to talk about to those who traded across the Santa Fe Trail from St. Louis to Santa Fe about Santa Fe, and vice versa. She would have been able to talk to New Mexicans like Juan Lucero and Vicente Villanueva, who spent the winter of 1792 in St. Louis. Those are the conversations I would love to have heard.
Of course.
Is what did she want to know about Santa Fe and Taos, and what did they tell her? I kind of think that those, and I can't prove any of this, but I think that those men, Vicente Villanueva went on to be the alcalde of San Miguel del Vado, and very important in the story of San Miguel del Vado and Eastern Pecos frontier. And I think that they must have carried those stories back to Santa Fe and Taos about these people living in St. Louis. And I think that's how Jose Julian Jaques learns about his mother and knows to come over to St. Louis. So absolutely, I think people are telling stories about each other to each end of the trail, just as we do now. And just as any of the books that were written on the Santa Fe Trail are throughout history, people are explaining to each other what they've seen, what they've done, who they know, what they saw. So I think that's likely.
Here's a question from Catherine Williamson. Did women deliver babies along the trail?
Yes, they did. I'm trying to think. There are a couple of stories of both very young babies traveling along the trail and also being born on the trail. I know of two women, Kate Kingsbury and I've forgotten the other woman's name, but Kate Kingsbury and another woman who came across in the summer, actually the fall of 1857. They both are pregnant on the trail and then deliver babies by December and January. So they're pretty pregnant when they come across. And then there are some very young babies who go across the trail. The other thing that happens on the trail is that traders are also ransoming and rescuing women and children and taking them back to either New Mexico or Missouri to be reunited with their families. Another thing I'll get to write someday.
Of course. Well, so here's a related question from Laurie Tiller Howell. I believe she said, but that African Americans were excluded from Old New Mexico. Is that correct?
There are very few. I'm working on research right now, and there are more enslaved people who come across the Santa Fe Trail with the Army of the West and with Santa Fe Trail traders. So, but they're often not really named. They're described by their occupation, both men and women. But they're not tremendously welcome in New Mexico. And in the mid-19th century, there is a prohibition against where African Americans can live, work, and be, and what their experiences are in New Mexico. But African Americans and Africans are certainly known from documents quite early in New Mexico's history. So
right.
They're,
Well, some would have come up from Mexico, right, from the other direction early on.
Exactly.
Here's an interesting question from Alexandra Kelly. How do you balance the possibility or likelihood of rape/sexual coercion violence on the one hand with female agency empowerment in these histories? I mean, didn't really sort of imply that Maria Rosa was raped, or at least it wasn't a consensual relationship if she was kidnapped. So how do you work through those issues in your work?
I mean, I don't work through them. I just kind of state them, and that's a very much a part of the story. Now, Maria Rosa, I think, emerges from that to she I think she says it herself. Lambert and Antoine, who are probably her first son, Antoine, who's the Métis son, never has the rights that Lambert will have. Lambert inherits considerable property to her, and she herself doesn't really accept Antoine. Although when he dies before she does, she goes after his creditors. So she excludes him from her will very deliberately. But then when he dies, she goes after his creditors to collect the credit as his mother. So she's complicated.
Yeah.
But the story, I mean, the stories of rape, the stories of women as trade objects are very much a part of the story of the Santa Fe Trail and of slavery and enslavement. And it's a hard part to write about, very hard.
Sure, I'm sure it is. We've come up on the 75-minute mark. So let me just, there's a comment that came in, I'll read it from Kathleen. It says, just a comment from Ohio regarding the future of this virtual salon. Thoroughly enjoyed your lecture. Thanks to Frances for the time and effort she spent researching the contribution of women in the settlement of the West. Please considering offering all salons in a virtual and on-site manner in the future. Well, under the present circumstances, we have no choice, and we're all in on electronic communication. Obviously, we're SAR, and I'm sure Pete Warzel would say the same thing about the Historic Santa Fe Foundation. We're all looking forward to the day when we can meet our members and friends face to face. But for now, we are, as I said, all in on electronics, and the response is amazing. So for example, we had, I think, 340 people who participated today. That's about 4 times more than we can fit into the boardroom at SAR. So I think this is something that we're really thinking hard about. This is going to be part of our future and that of many organizations. And I just want to thank Fran Levine for doing such a terrific job, and thank the 340 mostly anonymous participants for joining us for this conversation. I'm going to check out with that. Thanks again, Fran.
Thank you, Michael.